Welcome back to Silent Paws and Brave Hearts. There are mornings in the Arizona desert when the silence is so complete, so vast, that a man can hear his own heartbreak. Ethan Calloway heard his every single morning now. He stood on the porch of the old farmhouse before sunrise, a mug of coffee cooling between his palms, staring out at what 3 years of drought had done to the land his family had loved for over a century. The orchard his grandfather had planted with his own hands stood in broken rows, bare, twisted branches reaching toward a sky that had stopped answering. The creek his father had taught him to fish in at age 6 had pulled itself underground 2 summers ago and never returned. The soil his great-grandmother had called the color of cinnamon had cracked into pale, lifeless patterns that reminded Ethan of things he had seen in war zones. Broken things. Things past saving. He was 57 years old, and for the first time in his life, he did not know if he could hold on. The bank's 3rd letter of the month sat unopened on the kitchen table behind him. He didn't need to read it. He already knew what it said. He raised the mug to his lips. The coffee had gone completely cold. And then he felt it. The warm, familiar weight pressing against the side of his leg. Rex. The German shepherd had come through the screen door without a sound, the way he always did in the early mornings, as though he understood that silence was sacred at this hour. He didn't nudge, he didn't whine. He simply pressed his broad, warm body against Ethan's leg and stood there, steady and still and completely present. The way Rex had always been present, with a wholeness that very few living things ever manage. Ethan looked down at him. Rex looked up. Those dark, deep eyes held something Ethan had never been able to fully name in 4 years of looking into them. It wasn't pity. It wasn't the eager brightness of a dog seeking approval. It was something older and quieter. Something that said, without a single word, "I know. I see you. I am not going anywhere." Ethan lowered his hand slowly to Rex's head. His fingers moved through the thick fur behind the dog's ears, a gesture so worn smooth by 4 years of repetition that it had become less a choice and more a reflex, like breathing, like reaching for a lamp in the dark that your hand has found 1,000 times before. "Another hard morning, Rex," he said quietly. Rex leaned harder into his leg and closed his eyes. That was enough. That had always been enough. Ethan had not planned to come back to this farm. He had told himself on his last deployment that he was done with the land, done with the relentless demands of soil and weather and the machinery that always broke at the worst possible moment. 22 years of military service had taken him through 2 wars, 4 deployments, and classified operations he still could not name. He had come home at 42 with a Purple Heart, a titanium rod in his left femur, and a mind that sometimes could not tell the difference between an Arizona night and a combat zone. But when his mother called to say his father had died and the farm was his, something in Ethan's chest simply turned, like a key in a lock he hadn't known was there. He came home. He spent 4 years restoring the land, replanting the orchard, repainting the farmhouse the same soft cream his mother had chosen in 1971. The post-traumatic stress was with him always, the nightmares, the hypervigilance, the days when the world pressed too close. But the land helped. The rhythm of it, the honesty of it, the way it asked only for work and returned something real. And then Rex came into his life. The program coordinator in Tucson had explained professionally that Rex had been trained to assist veterans with post-traumatic stress. What she had not said, because it was not written in any manual, was that Rex would become the first living creature in years that Ethan felt completely himself around.
Not the careful version of himself, not the version that monitored his own reactions and pre-planned exit routes in crowded rooms. With Rex, Ethan did not perform anything. He simply existed. And Rex received him, completely, without condition, without the slight adjustment in another person's eyes that told you they were recalibrating how to handle you. Rex did not handle him. Rex simply loved him. Within the first month, the dog had learned things about Ethan that Ethan did not fully know about himself. He knew exactly how many minutes before a panic episode Ethan's breathing would shift. He knew the difference between the silence of a man at peace and the silence of a man holding himself together by the thinnest thread. He knew that Ethan's left hand trembled slightly when an old memory was surfacing, and he would place his paw on that hand, gently and deliberately, with the quiet certainty of a creature acting not from training, but from love. At night, Rex slept on the floor beside Ethan's bed. When the nightmares came, and they still came, in the third year the same as in the first, Rex would be there before Ethan was fully awake, his warm weight against the mattress, his breath against Ethan's hand, pulling him back from whatever burning place the dream had taken him. Ethan would grip the dog's fur in the dark and breathe, just breathe. And slowly, the room would become a room again, and the night would become simply a night, and nothing more dangerous than that. The paperwork said Ethan had rescued Rex from a shelter. Ethan knew better. Rex had rescued him, long before Ethan had understood what he needed rescuing from. There was one memory Ethan carried from his childhood that he had never spoken aloud to anyone. He was 9 years old. It was a Sunday afternoon in late October, and his father, Thomas Calloway, Air Force engineer, a quiet man who smelled of graphite pencils and dark coffee, had taken him walking through the north pasture. They had walked without talking, the way his father preferred, the dry grass crunching under their boots. And when they reached the ancient mound at the pasture's edge, his father had stopped. He had stood very still for a long moment, looking at it with an expression Ethan could not read. Then he had placed his hand on Ethan's shoulder, firmly, warmly, and said nothing at all. Just his hand, just the weight of it. Ethan had felt in that moment that his father was trying to tell him something he did not yet have words for. He never found out what it was. His father died when Ethan was 40, and some doors close before we think to walk through them. Now, standing on the cracked earth of the north pasture 48 years later, Ethan looked at that same mound and felt the ghost of that hand on his shoulder. The agricultural surveys had been clear. The soil beneath the mound tested high in mineralization consistent with an underground water source. Water, the single word that contained every remaining hope. If there was an aquifer beneath that ancient clay, it could save the orchard, save the farm, save a 100-year love story between one family and one piece of ground. He had nothing left to lose. He started the bulldozer. The blades struck the hardened clay with a sound like an argument beginning. Dust erupted into the dry air. The machine shuddered and bucked beneath him. Sweat ran into Ethan's eyes. He pushed harder, jaw set the way it had been set in places where giving up meant something far worse than losing a farm. He almost didn't hear Rex over the engine noise. Almost.
But something. Some frequency below conscious hearing, some channel that 4 years of absolute trust had opened between them, made Ethan look toward the mound's base. What he saw made him cut the engine immediately. Rex was not performing any alert he had ever used before. He was running in tight, frantic circles around one precise spot, his claws tearing at the earth, his barking carrying a desperate urgency that cut through the settling dust like a human voice, like a man trying to say something with everything he had because words were not available to him. Ethan climbed down without hesitating. He walked to Rex and knelt beside him in the pale dust. He looked into the dog's eyes,
those dark, steady, ancient eyes, and saw something he had never seen there before. Not fear, not confusion, something almost like recognition, like Rex had been waiting for this moment and was now saying, "Finally, finally you stopped. Now come and see." "Show me," Ethan said quietly. Together, on their knees in the Arizona dirt, they dug. The shovel struck metal 40 minutes later. The sound rang out across the silent plain, hollow and resonant and unmistakable. Rex stepped back 2 paces, then pressed immediately forward again, nose low and urgent. Ethan cleared the remaining soil with his bare hands, and what emerged from the earth stopped his heart for a full, suspended second. A steel hatch, military grade, rusted by 60 years of desert heat, but intact, and stamped into its surface in faded but legible characters, words that reached up through the ground and took hold of something deep inside Ethan's chest. Project Eclipse, United States Air Force, 1968, authorized personnel only. He sat back on his heels and stared at those words. To the southwest, a wall of brown dust was building along the horizon, slow and enormous, the way certain things move when they are inevitable. But Ethan did not see the storm. He was back in a Sunday afternoon in October, 48 years ago, his father's hand on his shoulder. His father's silence, the way Thomas Calloway had looked at this mound with that unreadable expression and then looked away. "The North Field is not for us, Ethan. Some things are left alone for good reason." Ethan pressed his palm flat against the rusted steel. Rex pressed against his side, warm and solid and real, the most real thing in the world. "Dad," Ethan whispered, "what did you bury out here?" The hatch opened after 20 minutes with a crowbar, groaning with the sound of something that has held a secret for a very long time, finally releasing it. Cold, stale air rose from the darkness below, carrying the scent of sealed metal and stopped time. Ethan looked at Rex for a long moment. He did something he rarely did. He took the dog's face gently in both hands. Rex went perfectly still. His eyes looked back with that deep, patient, fathomless knowing that had always undone Ethan more completely than anything else in his life. "Stay," Ethan said softly. "Guard the hatch. I'll come back to you." Rex sat at the edge of the opening, still as stone. Ethan descended into the dark. The chamber below was large and cold and silent, with the particular silence of a place that has not heard a human sound in 60 years. Ethan swept his flashlight slowly across the space. Steel shelving, sealed containers, a planning table covered in maps, weighted down by coffee mugs dried to powder 5 decades ago. A chalkboard holding equations in chalk no hand had touched since before Ethan was born. And on the planning table, in the center of everything, a manila folder. He crossed the chamber. He picked it up. He read the name written on the cover in handwriting he would have recognized in any darkness, in any condition, after any number of years. His father's handwriting. Water Recovery Systems, High Desert Implementation, Personal Notes, T. Calloway. His hands were trembling as he opened it. Inside were pages of careful engineering notes, diagrams, calculations, system designs, all focused on one subject. Not weapons, not anything dark or dangerous. Water. His father had spent 3 years under the classified Project Eclipse program, designing and building an underground water recovery system for high desert terrain. It used the natural aquifer beneath the mound. It had been sealed when the program lost its funding in 1971, left in the earth, patient as stone, waiting in the dark without complaint. The last page was a letter, personal, handwritten, dated October 14th, 1971. Ethan read it once and could not see through his tears. He pressed the back of his hand against his eyes. Then he read it again. If anyone finds this, and I believe someone will someday when the need is great enough, the system is still viable. The aquifer is stable and deep. The filtration units need servicing, but the design is sound. I built this for the land. I built it for whoever comes after me, whoever loves this ground enough to need water when the sky won't give it. I could not take it with me when they shut the program down, but I could leave it here. I could trust the earth to hold it until the right hands arrived. I hope those hands belong to someone who loves this place the way I do. I hope they did not have to wait too long. Thomas Calloway, Engineer, United States Air Force. Ethan sat down on the cold concrete floor of the chamber his father had built with his own hands. He pressed his back against the planning table, and he wept. Not the brief, controlled release of a man permitting himself a moment of feeling, but something much older and deeper. Grief for a father he had never fully known. Gratitude for a love that had waited 60 years in the dark to be found. Sorrow for every morning he had stood on this land, not knowing what was beneath his feet. And something without a name, something that felt exactly like a hand on a 9-year-old boy on a Sunday afternoon in October, saying without words what it had never learned to say out loud.
I was always here. I never left you anything but love. 40 feet above him, through the open hatch, Rex began to howl. Softly, steadily, like a vigil. Like a prayer. The dust storm hit while Ethan was still below. He climbed out into a world of howling brown darkness, the wind shrieking at 50 miles an hour, the sky the color of old copper. Rex was exactly where he had been left, sitting at the edge of the hatch, coat flattened by the gale, eyes nearly shut against the blowing grit. Not moved, not frightened, not gone. Ethan dropped to his knees in the blowing dirt and put both arms around his dog. He pressed his face into the thick, warm fur of Rex's neck and held on, the way a man holds on to the one real thing in a world that is dissolving around him. Rex made a sound deep in his chest, not a whimper, something deeper, something that moved through Ethan's sternum like a note struck on a cello in a quiet room. They sheltered in the truck. Rex lay across the seat with his head in Ethan's lap. Ethan held his father's folder against his chest with one hand and kept the other moving slowly through Rex's fur. Outside, the storm raged. Inside, there was something that felt, improbably and completely, like peace. He looked down at Rex in the amber dark. Rex looked up at him. "How did you know?" Ethan whispered. Rex blinked slowly and pressed his chin more deeply into Ethan's knee. Some things do not need explaining. They only need trusting. And Ethan had spent 4 years learning to trust this dog the way you learn to trust the ground beneath your feet in unfamiliar terrain, completely, without reservation, because the alternative is a loneliness that nothing else can reach. 6 weeks later, Howard Birch, a retired civil engineer from Tucson, a man who spoke about aquifers with the reverence most people reserve for secret things, descended the ladder, studied Thomas Calloway's designs, and came back up with dust on his knees and something close to wonder on his weathered face. "Your father built something extraordinary down there," he said quietly. "He built it like he knew someone was going to need it someday." Veterans from across Cochise County came on 3 consecutive Saturdays. They asked for nothing. They brought their own tools. One older man, a Vietnam veteran named Earl,
quiet as a fence post, arrived every Saturday at 7 in the morning and worked until the light was gone. When it was finished, he shook Ethan's hand and said only, "Your daddy would be proud of you, son," and got in his truck and drove away without looking back. Ethan called the bank. He asked for 60 days. They said yes. On a Tuesday morning in early November, 63 days after Rex had barked at the mound, Howard activated the restored filtration system. They stood in a half circle around the outlet pipe in the northern field. Ethan, Howard, 6 veterans, and Rex. The dog was pressed against Ethan's leg, his shoulder firm and warm, positioned exactly as he always positioned himself when something important was happening, as though he knew, as though he had always known. The pipe shuddered. It coughed. Then water came, clean and cold and clear, rising from 60 feet below the Arizona hardpan through a system a quiet man had built alone in 1968 and sealed away with hope, leaving it for hands he loved without knowing their name. Flowing out into the pale November light like something that had simply been waiting for permission to be received. No one spoke. One by one, without being asked, the men removed their hats.
Rex stood slowly and pressed the full weight of his head against Ethan's hip. Ethan's hand found the dog's neck. His fingers held on. The water ran, steady and generous and clean, and Ethan stood in the November light with his hand on his dog and his father's words in his chest, and felt the land holding him the way it had always held his family, with a patience that outlasted drought and grief and the long silences between fathers and sons who love each other without always finding the way to say so. The farm did not recover overnight, but it began. And beginning, when you have stood at the very edge of the end, is the most sacred word in the world. By spring, young orchard trees stood in fresh rows across the northern field, their roots reaching toward the aquifer Thomas Calloway had mapped by hand more than half a century ago. The bank letters stopped. The creek had a trickle again. And on some mornings, when the light came across the new trees in a certain way, Ethan could almost see what the farm had looked like in his grandfather's time, alive and full and loved. Rex was always beside him on those mornings, every single one, pressing warm against his leg in the gray light before sunrise, walking the rows with him through the cool air, ranging ahead and circling back with the easy, faithful grace of a creature who has decided that one human being's life is worth everything, and acts on that decision every day, without fanfare, without expectation, without ever once needing to be thanked. Ethan thought on those mornings about what had really been buried beneath the mound. Not the water system, not the engineering notebooks. The love, the long, patient, underground love of a father who could not say what he felt, but could spend 3 years building something to leave behind. Who could not explain why the north field was sacred, but trusted the earth to hold the reason until someone who needed it arrived. Love does not always announce itself. Sometimes it waits in the dark for 60 years. Sometimes it sits at the edge of an open hatch in a raging storm and simply refuses to leave. Sometimes it runs desperate circles in the dust around the one spot that matters, barking with everything it has, until the person who needs to hear it finally stops the machine, walks over, and kneels down to listen. Ethan had fought in 2 wars. He had carried grief across 2 decades. He had stood at the edge of losing the land his family had loved for 100 years. And a dog had led him to the water. On a warm June evening, 1 year after Rex had barked at the mound, Ethan sat on the porch in the long golden light. His coffee was warm. The young orchard cast long shadows across the field.
The air smelled of water and living things, and the quiet sweetness of a desert evening after an honest day of work. Rex lay at his feet, with his chin resting on his paws, watching the evening with the calm of a creature completely at peace with his place in the world. On the small table beside Ethan's chair sat his father's folder in its protective sleeve. On top of it, one photograph. Thomas Calloway in his Air Force uniform in 1968, standing in the Arizona desert with the quiet expression of a man who is building something he knows will outlast him. Something that will find its way, eventually, to the hands it was always meant for. Ethan looked at the photograph for a long time. The sun touched the horizon. The desert turned to gold. "Found it, Dad," he said softly. "Found everything you left me." Rex lifted his head and looked at Ethan, those steady, faithful, ancient eyes holding all the patience in the world. Then he laid his head slowly back down on his paws and let out a long, quiet breath. The sound of a creature who has done exactly what he came to do. The sound of love finally resting. The young trees moved gently in the evening breeze. The water ran clean and steady beneath the field, and the land, patient as a father's love, buried 60 years in the dark, faithful as a dog who never once moved from his post, simply went on living. Some of us spend our whole lives walking over the very thing we need most, never knowing it is there. It takes loss and desperation and one faithful soul who refuses to stop until we listen, to bring us to our knees in the right place at the right time. Tonight, wherever you are, if you are missing someone you never got to fully know, if you are holding on by the thinnest thread, if the land beneath your feet feels like it is slipping away, we hope this story reminded you that love does not disappear. It waits, patient as water in the deep earth, faithful as a dog in a storm, ready to rise the moment you need it most. You are not alone. You were never alone. If this story reached something inside you tonight, if it reminded you of a father's quiet love, a faithful companion, or a place you would fight to keep, please subscribe to Silent Paws and Brave Hearts. Every story on this channel is written for you, for the ones who have lived long enough to know that the most important things in life don't make noise, they just stay. Hit the subscribe button, ring the bell, and share this with someone who needs to be reminded tonight that they are loved and that the ones who truly love us never really leave. We will see you in the next story. Until then, remember the ones who stayed. They always knew something the rest of the world forgot. Silent Paws and Brave Hearts, where every paw print leads to something sacred.